On Christmas night, Margaret Collins realized that the laughter in her own home did not include her. She sat alone at the far end of the dining table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, listening to the distant clinking of glasses and the warm hum of conversation drifting in from the living room. The house was glowing exactly as she had imagined it would. Soft golden lights wrapped around the banister, the scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey still lingering in the air, the tree standing tall in the corner with carefully wrapped gifts beneath it. She had spent nearly 3 weeks preparing everything, measuring ingredients down to the teaspoon, polishing every piece of china, making sure each stocking was filled with something thoughtful. It was the kind of Christmas she had created for decades, the kind that used to bring her family together. But this year, something felt different, and she could not ignore it anymore. Earlier that evening, Margaret had been in the kitchen, finishing the last batch of mashed potatoes, when she noticed the voices had grown louder in the living room. There was a brightness in the laughter, sharp, effortless, almost theatrical. Emily's voice stood out the most, light and carefree, as if she were hosting a party that Margaret had not been invited to. Margaret had wiped her hands on a dish towel and waited, expecting someone, Daniel, perhaps, to call her in, to say, "Mom, we're ready." No one did. Minutes passed, then more. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, each second stretching longer than the last. Finally, Margaret carried the serving dish into the dining room herself, only to find that most of the plates had already been used. Glasses were half empty, chairs were slightly pushed back, as if people had come and gone without ever thinking to look for her. Emily glanced up briefly, her smile polite but distant. "Oh, Margaret, we thought you were resting," she said, her tone smooth, almost rehearsed. Margaret nodded gently, placing the dish down as if nothing were out of place. She did not correct her. She did not ask why no one had come to get her. Instead, she took a seat at the end of the table, the one that had slowly, over the years, become hers by default rather than by choice. From there, she could hear everything but see very little. She heard Daniel laughing at something Emily said, a sound that used to belong to a different version of him, a younger man who once looked at his mother with warmth and familiarity. Now, his attention seemed fixed elsewhere, his presence tethered to the rhythm of his wife's voice. Margaret picked up her fork, though her appetite had long since disappeared. The food tasted exactly as it always had, perfectly seasoned, carefully prepared, but it felt hollow. Across the room, wrapping paper rustled, and someone cheered softly as a gift was opened. Margaret realized then that the exchange had already begun without her. No one had called her name. No one had handed her a present. She looked toward the tree, noticing how neatly the boxes were arranged, and for the first time, she wondered if any of them were meant for her at all. The realization did not come like a sudden blow. It settled slowly, quietly, like snow covering the ground overnight. By the time Margaret set her fork down, she understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not an oversight, and it was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision, and she had been gently, deliberately placed outside of it. The house grew quieter as the evening stretched on, but not in the way Margaret remembered from past holidays. This silence was not peaceful or content. It was selective, as if it had simply chosen to settle around her and nowhere else. From her seat, she watched as the others moved freely between rooms, carrying plates, refilling drinks, stepping around her chair without ever truly acknowledging her presence. It was subtle, almost polite, the kind of absence that could be explained away if someone tried hard enough. Margaret did not try. She sat still, her posture straight, her expression composed, as if she had practiced this moment long before it arrived. A few feet away, Emily leaned against the kitchen counter, her laughter rising again, softer this time but still bright enough to carry. She was telling a story, something about a holiday trip they were planning for the spring. Margaret caught fragments of it, mentions of flights, reservations, a house by the water. No one asked her opinion. No one turned to include her. Daniel stood beside his wife, nodding, smiling, occasionally adding a detail as though they had already made the decision together. Margaret realized then that this was not a new pattern. It had been forming quietly over months, perhaps even years. hidden inside moments that seemed too small to question at the time. She thought back to the previous Thanksgiving, when dinner had been rescheduled without telling her until the morning of. She remembered a birthday lunch that had been moved to a restaurant she could not easily get to, only to be told later that they assumed she would not want to make the drive. Each moment had come with a gentle explanation, a reasonable excuse, something that allowed her to accept it without conflict. But sitting there now, listening to plans being made for a future she was not part of, Margaret could see the pattern clearly for the first time. It was not about convenience. It was not about misunderstanding. It was about distance, carefully maintained and quietly enforced. She reached for her glass of water and took a small sip, the motion slow and deliberate. Across the room, a gift bag tore open and someone clapped. Emily's voice rose again, congratulating, praising, directing attention exactly where she wanted it. Margaret followed the sound with her eyes and noticed how naturally Emily seemed to command the space, how easily everyone else adjusted around her. It was not loud or forceful. It was controlled. And Daniel followed that control without hesitation. Margaret set her glass back down and folded her hands once more, her fingers resting lightly against each other. She did not feel anger. Not yet. What she felt was something colder, something steadier. Understanding, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but settles piece by piece until it becomes impossible to ignore. For years, she had believed that love within a family did not need to be questioned, that it would remain constant even as circumstances changed. But now, as she sat at the edge of her own home, she began to see that love could be redefined without a single word being spoken. And once it did not ask for permission, simply moved on, leaving behind whatever no longer fit its new shape. Margaret remained seated long after most of the wrapping paper had been cleared away, her gaze resting on the soft glow of the Christmas tree, as the room slowly shifted into a different kind of evening. The initial excitement had faded, replaced by smaller conversations and the quiet clatter of dishes being gathered in the kitchen. She noticed how naturally everyone moved around Emily, how decisions seemed to orbit her without question. When someone asked where to put the leftover food, they looked to Emily. When Daniel reached for a coat, he glanced at his wife first, waiting for her nod before stepping outside. It was a rhythm that had been established so smoothly that it no longer appeared unusual to anyone except Margaret. She rose carefully from her chair, carrying her untouched plate into the kitchen. The sink was already half full, and Emily stood at the counter, scrolling through her phone with a faint smile, her thumb moving steadily across the screen. Margaret set the plate down beside the others, rinsing it under warm water, her movements quiet and efficient. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily glanced up, just briefly, her expression pleasant but distant. "You did a lovely job with dinner," she said, as if reading from a script she had used many times before. Margaret inclined her head slightly, accepting the comment without responding. There was something about the tone that felt complete in itself, as though no further conversation was expected. Margaret dried her hands on a towel and turned slightly, her eyes falling on the refrigerator door where a small calendar hung. Several dates had been circled in bright ink, notes written in a neat, unfamiliar handwriting. She stepped closer, reading the entries one by one. Weekend getaway, dinner with clients, spring trip, beach house confirmed. Each note seemed to describe a life that was being organized and lived just beyond her reach. She did not recognize any of it. Behind her, Emily continued typing, the soft tapping of her nails against the phone screen filling the silence. Margaret turned back toward the doorway, intending to return to the dining room, but paused when she heard her name spoken in a low voice. It was Daniel, standing just outside the kitchen, speaking quietly to his wife. Margaret did not move. "Do you think she noticed?" he asked, his voice careful, almost hesitant. Emily's response came without delay, her tone light, unconcerned. "She notices what she wants to notice," she said. "It is better this way." less complicated. There was a brief pause, and Margaret could almost feel the space where a different answer might have existed. But it passed quickly. Daniel let out a small breath, the kind that suggested agreement rather than doubt. I just do not want any tension, he added. Emily gave a soft laugh, not unkind, but dismissive in a way that settled heavily in the air. Then do not create any, she replied. Margaret stood very still, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the counter. The words did not shock her. Not anymore. Instead, they fit neatly into the pattern she had already begun to see. She stepped back into the dining room without making a sound, her presence unnoticed once again. The tree lights flickered gently, reflecting in the glass ornaments she had hung herself just days before. For a long moment, she simply stood there, taking in the quiet, the space, the absence. And in that stillness, something within her shifted, not loudly or dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that felt stronger than anything she had experienced that evening. She no longer wondered if she was being excluded. She knew, and knowing, she realized, was the first step towards something she had not yet fully defined. Margaret did not return to the kitchen again that night. Instead, she moved slowly toward the staircase, her steps measured and quiet, as though she had already begun separating herself from the life continuing below. The voices behind her rose and fell in soft waves, blending with the faint music still playing somewhere in the background, but none of it reached her the way it once had. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused briefly, her hand resting on the banister polished smooth from years of use, and allowed herself a single glance back. From that distance, the scene looked almost perfect, like something from a holiday postcard. Warm light, familiar faces, effortless laughter. It was only when you stood inside it that the truth revealed itself. In her bedroom, the air felt still and undisturbed. The bed was neatly made, the quilt folded just as she had left it that morning. A small lamp cast a soft glow across the dresser, where framed photographs stood in quiet rows. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes moving from one image to the next. There was Daniel as a boy, no more than 8 years old, grinning widely as he held up a handmade ornament he had insisted on placing at the very top of the tree. She remembered that night clearly. He had refused to go to bed until it was done, his small hands determined, his voice full of excitement. "It has to be perfect, Mom," he had said. "It is Christmas." Margaret reached out and adjusted the frame slightly, her fingers lingering on the edge as if the gesture might steady something inside her. She moved to the next photograph, one taken years later. On a different Christmas morning, Daniel stood beside her, taller now, his arm resting lightly around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. That had been the year after his father passed, the first holiday they had faced alone together. It had not been easy, but they had found a way to carry on, to create something that still felt like home. Margaret could still remember the quiet promise she had made to herself then, that she would keep the traditions alive, that she would hold the family together no matter how much had changed. She stepped back from the dresser and sat down slowly at the edge of the bed. The house beneath her felt distant now, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. She thought about the small moments that had led them here, the ones she had dismissed or overlooked because they seemed too insignificant to matter. The time Emily had suggested hosting Christmas at a different hour, claiming it would be more convenient, and how that hour had slowly shifted later each year. The quiet rearrangement of rooms, the subtle changes in routine, the way decisions had begun to happen without her input, then without her knowledge at all. None of it had happened suddenly. That was what made it so effective. It had unfolded gradually, carefully, until the absence it created felt almost natural. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her gaze settling on the window where faint reflections of the tree lights shimmered against the glass. For a long moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it, not as pain, but as recognition. The life she had built, the role she had held for so many years, had not been taken from her in a single moment. It had been replaced, piece by piece, until there was no space left for her within it. And yet, as she sat there in the quiet of her room, Margaret realized something else, something that had been hidden beneath all the noise and distraction. If something could be replaced, it could also be reclaimed in a different form, not restored to what it had been, but reshaped into something new, something that did not depend on the approval or presence of those who had chosen to move on without her. She drew in a slow breath and let it out just as steadily, her shoulders relaxing as the thoughts settled into place. Downstairs, the laughter continued, unaware that anything had changed. But Margaret understood now that something had. Not in the house, not in the people gathered there, but in her. And that, she sensed, would matter far more than anything they had chosen to leave behind. Margaret did not sleep much that night. The house eventually quieted, the last footsteps fading, doors closing one by one until only silence remained. But her mind stayed awake, steady and alert in a way that felt unfamiliar. She lay on her side, facing the window, watching the faint glow of the streetlights filter through the curtains, and allowed her thoughts to settle into something more structured. By morning, the clarity had not faded. It had sharpened. She rose earlier than usual, moving through her routine with calm precision, as if each action had been rehearsed. The kitchen was empty when she stepped inside, the remains of the previous evening still visible in small, careless details. A glass left on the counter, a chair slightly out of place, wrapping paper gathered into a loose pile near the trash. Margaret began tidying quietly, not out of obligation, but out of habit. She rinsed dishes, wiped surfaces, restored order where it had been disrupted. When she finished, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the neighborhood looked unchanged, a few decorations still glowing faintly in the daylight, the world continuing as it always did. Margaret took a slow sip and reached for her phone, her fingers steady as she scrolled through her contacts. She paused briefly before selecting a name she had not called in some time. Thomas Reed. The line rang twice before his voice answered, warm and professional. He had been their family attorney for years, someone her late husband had trusted without hesitation. Margaret listened to his greeting, then spoke in a tone that matched his own, calm and direct. She asked if he had time to meet. Nothing urgent, just something she would like to review. Thomas agreed without question, suggesting a time later that week. Margaret thanked him and ended the call, setting the phone down with a quiet sense of completion. She did not rush. She did not feel the need to explain herself to anyone. Instead, she finished her coffee and rose from the table, moving toward the hallway where a small cabinet stood against the wall. Inside, neatly organized, were documents she had kept over the years, papers that had once seemed like formalities but now felt significant in a different way. She opened the drawer and looked through them one by one, her eyes scanning dates, signatures, details she had not revisited in a long time. The house remained quiet around her, unaware of the shift that had begun. When Daniel finally came downstairs, his movements slow, his attention already fixed on his phone, he greeted her with a casual nod, as if nothing unusual had occurred the night before. Emily followed shortly after, her presence composed, her expression unchanged. They spoke to each other about plans for the day, errands, a visit to a friend, conversations that flowed easily between them. Margaret listened without interruption, her face neutral, her posture relaxed. She did not insert herself into their plans, nor did she wait to be included. When Emily glanced toward her and offered a brief, polite smile, Margaret returned it with the same quiet courtesy. There was no tension in the exchange, no visible conflict, only distance, clearly defined and now fully understood. After a moment, Margaret excused herself and returned to her room, closing the door gently behind her. She sat once more at the edge of the bed, her hands resting lightly in her lap, and allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form. It was not born of satisfaction or relief, but of certainty. For the first time in a long while, she was no longer reacting to what was happening around her. She was preparing for what would come next. And this time, she would decide how the story moved forward. Margaret arrived at Thomas Reed's office precisely 10 minutes before their scheduled appointment, her coat neatly pressed, her posture composed, her expression unreadable to anyone who might have passed her in the hallway. The building itself was familiar. A quiet brick structure with tall windows and polished floors that reflected the soft overhead lighting. She had been there many times before, usually at her husband's side, listening as he discussed matters she trusted him to handle. This time, she walked in alone, her step steady, her purpose clear. Thomas greeted her warmly, rising from behind his desk and offering a firm handshake, his tone carrying the same respect it always had. He gestured for her to sit, asking if everything was all right, if there was anything urgent he should be aware of. Margaret took her seat and placed her handbag carefully beside her, her hands resting lightly on her lap before she spoke. She assured him that nothing was urgent, at least not in the way people usually meant it. Then, with a calmness that did not require effort, she began to explain that she wanted to review her estate, her assets, and the current structure of her will. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression attentive, his pen moving occasionally across a notepad as she outlined her request. He asked a few clarifying questions, professional and precise, making sure he understood the scope of what she was asking. Margaret answered each one clearly, without hesitation, as if she had already gone through every possible detail in her mind before stepping into the room. When Thomas pulled up the existing documents, he walked her through them line by line, explaining how everything was currently arranged, how ownership was structured, and what would happen under different circumstances. Margaret followed along closely, her gaze focused, her attention unwavering. At one point, Thomas paused and looked at her more carefully, as if sensing that something beneath the surface had changed. He did not ask directly, but his tone softened slightly when he mentioned that adjustments could always be made, that nothing was fixed beyond revision. Margaret nodded once, a small, controlled gesture that carried more meaning than words. She told him exactly what she wanted changed. Certain assets would no longer be transferred automatically. Access would be limited. Conditions would be added, specific and clear, leaving no room for interpretation. Thomas listened, then repeated her instructions back to her to ensure accuracy. There was no surprise in his reaction, only professionalism, but there was a quiet understanding in the way he met her eyes afterward, as if he recognized the significance of what she was doing without needing to name it. When the documents were prepared for revision, Margaret reviewed them carefully, her gaze moving slowly across each page. She did not rush. She did not second-guess. When she reached the final page, she picked up the pen and signed her name with the same steady hand she had always possessed. The act itself was simple, almost routine, but it marked a boundary that had not existed before. Thomas gathered the papers, assuring her that everything would be finalized and securely filed, that copies would be available whenever she needed them. Margaret thanked him, rising from her seat with quiet grace, her movements unhurried. As she stepped back into the daylight, the air felt crisp, the world unchanged in every visible way. Yet there was a distinct difference in how she moved through it now. She no longer carried the uncertainty that had followed her in recent months. In its place was something quieter, something stronger. She had not raised her voice. She had not confronted anyone. But she had taken control of something that had once been assumed, and in doing so, she had shifted the balance in a way that no one in her house had yet realized. And that, she understood, was exactly how it needed to be. Margaret returned home in the early afternoon, the quiet of the house greeting her in a way that felt almost familiar now, as if it had begun to mirror the calm she carried within herself. She set her coat aside, placed her handbag neatly on the table, and moved through the rooms with a steady, un'uriet pace. Nothing appeared different. The same furniture, the same decorations, the same faint scent of pine lingering from the tree in the corner. Yet the space felt altered in a way that could not be seen, only understood. In the days that followed, Margaret did not change her routine. She prepared meals, kept the house in order, spoke when spoken to, and maintained the same composed presence she had always shown. To anyone watching, it would have seemed as though nothing had shifted. But beneath that surface, Margaret observed everything with a clarity she had not allowed herself before. She noticed how Emily continued to guide conversations, how decisions were made in quiet exchanges that excluded her entirely. She noticed how Daniel rarely looked at her directly anymore, his attention consistently drawn elsewhere, as if avoiding something he could not quite face. Margaret did not react. She did not question. She simply watched. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the house settled into its usual rhythm, Margaret found herself in the living room, seated near the window with a book resting unopened in her hands. Across the room, Emily spoke casually about upcoming plans, mentioning a spring trip once again, this time with more detail. Flights had been booked, reservations confirmed. It was all arranged. Daniel responded with quiet approval, asking a few practical questions, his tone easy, unquestioning. Margaret listened without lifting her eyes, her expression unchanged. No one turned to include her. No one paused to consider whether she might have thoughts of her own. It was as though her presence existed only in the background, a constant that required no acknowledgement. Later that evening, as Emily stepped out of the room to take a phone call, Daniel lingered for a moment, shifting slightly as if uncertain whether to speak. Margaret turned a page in her book, though she had not read a single word, and waited. After a brief hesitation, Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Mom," he began, his voice careful. "We were thinking, it might be easier if you took it easy more often. You do not have to handle everything around here." Margaret looked up then, meeting his gaze with a calm that did not invite misunderstanding. There was no accusation in her eyes, no visible disappointment, only quiet attention. "I see," she replied, her voice even, measured. Daniel nodded, relieved perhaps by the absence of resistance. "It is just less stress for everyone," he added, as though the explanation completed itself. Margaret inclined her head slightly, accepting the words without challenge. "Of course," she said. Daniel offered a small, almost grateful smile before stepping away, the moment dissolving as quickly as it had formed. Margaret returned her gaze to the book in her hands, her fingers resting lightly against the page. She did not feel dismissed. She did not feel diminished. Instead, she recognized the statement for what it was, not a suggestion, but a confirmation. The role she had once held was no longer expected of her. It had already been reassigned, quietly and without discussion. And in that realization, Margaret found not loss, but space. Space to step back. Space to choose differently. Space to act without needing permission. She closed the book gently and set it aside, her mind already moving ahead, considering the next steps with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning. Nothing in the house had changed. Not yet. But Margaret understood that change did not always begin where others could see it. Sometimes, it began in silence, in decisions made without announcement, in paths chosen without consultation. And once those decisions were set in motion, the outcome no longer depended on those who had chosen to look away. The following week unfolded with a quiet predictability, the kind that often concealed the most significant changes. Margaret moved through each day with the same composed rhythm, her presence steady, her actions deliberate, yet increasingly selective. She no longer involved herself in conversations that did not include her. She no longer offered help before it was asked. And most notably, she no longer anticipated being considered in plans that were clearly not meant for her. Instead, she began to direct her attention elsewhere, toward details that had once remained in the background of her life, but now held a different kind of importance. One afternoon, She sat at her desk near the window, a small stack of documents arranged neatly before her. The sunlight filtered through the glass, casting soft patterns across the pages as she reviewed them one by one. Bank statements, property records, insurance details. Each document represented a piece of a life she had built over decades, a life that had been quietly assumed by others without question. Margaret traced the lines of text with her eyes, absorbing the information not with urgency, but with precision. She was not searching for something lost. She was confirming what remained. Downstairs, she could hear Emily moving through the kitchen, her voice drifting in and out as she spoke on the phone. The tone was light, confident, filled with the ease of someone who believed everything was already in place. Margaret listened only long enough to recognize the pattern, then returned her attention to the papers in front of her. There was no need to monitor what she already understood. Later that evening, Margaret made a series of small but deliberate adjustments. She updated account access, ensuring that notifications would be directed solely to her. She organized her personal records into clearly labeled folders, placing them in a secure location that only she could access. Each action was simple on its own, almost routine, but together they formed a structure that had not existed before. A boundary, quietly established. When Daniel and Emily returned from an outing the next day, their conversation carried the same familiar tone, filled with plans and casual remarks that moved effortlessly between them. Margaret greeted them politely, her expression calm, her voice even. She listened as Emily mentioned another upcoming gathering, something arranged with friends, something that did not require Margaret's involvement. There was no expectation in the way it was said, no pause for inclusion. Margaret responded with a brief acknowledgement, nothing more. She did not feel excluded. She felt informed, and there was a difference. As the days continued, Margaret's presence in the house became more defined, not through increased activity, but through intentional restraint. She chose when to engage, when to remain silent, when to step away. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible to those around her, but it altered the dynamic in ways that could not be easily undone. She was no longer reacting to the structure that had been placed around her. She was existing outside of it. One evening, as she stood by the window watching the last of the holiday lights dim across the neighborhood, Margaret allowed herself a moment of reflection. The house behind her remained unchanged, its routines intact, its patterns uninterrupted, but she understood now that those patterns no longer defined her role within it. She had moved beyond that without confrontation, without announcement, without resistance, and in doing so, she had created something far more powerful than any argument could have achieved. She had reclaimed her position, not within the household, but within herself. And from that place, every decision she made would carry a different weight, one that did not rely on recognition, approval, or inclusion. It relied only on clarity, and that clarity, she knew, would soon reveal itself in ways no one else had prepared for. The shift revealed itself on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that usually passed without notice. Margaret had already finished her breakfast and was seated near the window, a small envelope resting beside her untouched cup of coffee. Outside, the sky was pale and still, the neighborhood wrapped in a calm that made every sound inside the house feel slightly louder than it should have been. Daniel and Emily entered the kitchen together, their conversation low and casual, the rhythm between them unchanged. Emily spoke first, mentioning an upcoming appointment, something about finalizing details for their spring trip, while Daniel nodded, adding small confirmations as though everything had already been decided. Margaret listened for a moment, then reached for the envelope with a steady hand. "There is something you both should be aware of," she said, her voice calm, neither raised nor softened. The words did not interrupt their conversation so much as redirect it. Daniel paused, glancing toward her with mild curiosity, while Emily turned fully, her expression composed but attentive. Margaret placed the envelope on the table between them and slid it forward slightly. "I met with Thomas Reed earlier this week," she continued, her tone even, measured. The name alone carried enough familiarity to draw their full attention. Daniel's posture shifted, a subtle tightening in his shoulders, while Emily's gaze sharpened, her composure holding but no longer effortless. Margaret did not rush. She allowed the silence to settle before continuing. I have reviewed my estate and made several adjustments. Everything is now clearly outlined and secured. Daniel frowned slightly, confusion forming as he reached for the envelope but did not open it yet. What kind of adjustments? He asked, his voice careful, as though he were not entirely certain what he was asking. Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. The kind that ensure everything remains exactly where it belongs, she replied. Emily stepped closer then, her attention fixed on Margaret in a way it had not been before. Is there a reason for this? She asked, her tone controlled, polite on the surface but edged with something sharper beneath. Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the question without reacting to its undertone. Yes, she said simply. Clarity. Daniel opened the envelope then, scanning the documents quickly, his eyes moving from line to line as the meaning began to take shape. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, not filled with confusion, but with realization. Emily did not reach for the papers. She watched Daniel instead, reading his reaction, waiting for confirmation in the tightening of his expression. Margaret remained seated, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture unchanged. She did not explain further. She did not need to. After a moment, Daniel looked up, his voice quieter now. So this means, he began, but did not finish the sentence. Margaret gave a small nod, not to complete his thought, but to acknowledge that he understood enough. Emily's composure faltered for just a fraction of a second, a shift so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not been paying attention. But Margaret saw it clearly. For the first time, the balance had shifted in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. Not through argument, not through emotion, but through decision. Margaret rose from her chair with the same quiet grace she had always carried, adjusting the sleeve of her sweater as she stepped away from the table. You both have your plans, she said, her voice calm, almost reflective. Now I have mine. She did not wait for a response. She did not look back. As she walked toward the hallway, the house behind her felt different, not because it had changed, but because she no longer belonged to the version of it that had excluded her. And for the first time in a long while, that realization did not feel like loss, felt like freedom.